Welcome to EnterVR, the podcast where we talk about all things virtual reality. I'm your host, Chris Miranda, and on today's show, I am joined by E Mcneill, the creator of Darknet, and also goes by the name of Tetragrammaton. That I just murdered that name on the subreddits. Dude, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Cool. So you are a VR Jam Game Jam winner. Your last year's VR Game Jam winner. Tell me, man, I have so many questions going inside my head that I don't know where to start. Let's start with what is Darknet and how you wound up in that journey till now.
Sure. So Darknet is cyberpunk hacking game for the Oculus Rift. You know how all those cyberpunk games have like a hacking minigame?
Yes.
This is like a hacking maxi game. So it started its journey under the title CS, which was my entry to the VR Jam in, I think, August 2013. The VR Jam was a 3-week game-making competition hosted by Oculus and Indiecade, and I'm honored to say that CS was selected as the winner of the Open Call division.
Congratulations.
For that contest. And so that gave me all the validation and motivation I needed to turn it into a full title. And so since then, I spent a few months sort of wrapping up other business that I had going on, and then I sort of started on development in about December, and have been going since then. And just recently, I finally announced the game with its new title, new art that I got some help with from outside, and have been showing the game and demos at GDC. I'm going to be showing at PAX East in about a week and a half.
Wow.
And I think I'm going to be making the demo public soon as well.
That's extremely exciting. I just got to try. I just went through a quick fly through of CS, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. What can we anticipate? What can we expect for Darknet? How will it differentiate itself from CS?
Well, the structure of the game is fairly similar in that you're still sort of looking at an array of nodes that are all connected to each other and affecting each other. Yeah. And you can zoom inside any of those nodes and you're presented with sort of a hacking puzzle. Mm-hmm. And if you solve that, then you capture the node, you get money, you can upgrade your abilities, and you can proceed to more and more difficult nodes. The biggest change from Darknet to CS in terms of the gameplay is that the nature of that sort of hacking challenge has changed completely. There are there are similarities that you can see between the two versions, but the mechanic is now played out on a triangular tiling, like a triangular grid, and it's much more like a turn-based game, I would say. It's more discrete. It's not so much about just overpowering the enemy. It's more about sort of sneaking past them and trying to reach an objective. And it's really difficult to talk about, as you can tell. I'm speaking sort of vaguely, but I really enjoy abstract gameplay, and so that's what a lot of the game is composed of. And it's something that you sort of have to try for yourself to see how it works.
And the game in and out of itself feels like it's more or less treading on an abstract idea. This idea that you are, correct me if I'm wrong. You're a hacker inside this, recreation of the metaverse, trying to attain an objective. But again, the whole metaverse thing is an abstract thing in my mind, and so that's really cool how where did you get the inspiration to put this together from?
It's hard for me to say exactly. I assume that my biggest inspiration was Neuromancer, because I can't think of anything else that might have given me this idea, but I didn't particularly enjoy Neuromancer, actually. So who knows? All I know is that I've had this sort of image in my mind of, a hacker going through this 3D space of, abstract representations of data and, facing software on its own terms. essentially.
What is Neuromancer, for those who might not know, by the way? Sorry to interrupt.
Right, Neuromancer is a classic work of cyberpunk fiction. It's a novel by William Gibson. It was released, I think, in late 80s. I can look this up. Or actually 1984.
Oh,
How
wow.
appropriate.
Yeah.
Interesting. So it sort of was a foundational work of cyberpunk, I would say. Not the first, but oftentimes people's first encounter with it. And so it featured a character who was a hacker and sort of described cyberpunk in terms that sort of let people's imagination run wild, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You could sort of tell that it was somebody moving through this like 3D space. There was, ice, that was fighting back against him, and, firewalls and other software. And he's cutting through it, trying to reach data. But it's all just a visual metaphor. And so what appealed to me about this is, as a game designer, I could sort of make any gameplay that I wanted to within that theme. Because it's so vague, so much, so flexible according to however you imagine it.
Mm-hmm.
I could sort of make fun gameplay however I wanted, and then twist the presentation to fit that.
Oh. And this is all like concoction straight out of your mind. Do you have any other partners or any other people working with you?
I have some people who are helping me with select elements of development. So, I work with a guy named Michael Heald, who is a really talented artist, and so I was able to present him essentially like CS, the previous version that I did all myself, and he was able to take that and transform it into something that actually looked good. Because I don't have much of a visual mind myself, and I'm really happy with the new art direction he brought to it.
Nice. And then, walk me through your background. How did you wound up becoming a virtual reality developer?
Well, I've been developing games in some sense for a really long time, maybe 9 years or so, if you go all the way back. I've been indie for about a year and a half, and a lot of that time was sort of spent prototyping, trying to figure out a good project that was really worthy of my attention and time.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the big challenges for indies is how to stand out, especially if you're a new indie, or especially if it's a really crowded field. Like mobile games, for example, were a really promising environment for indies early on, and now they're kind of overcrowded.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that you can't find success, but, it's difficult. And so I was sort of interested in newer emerging platforms. So I did like a little prototype for the Leap Motion when that was, first coming out. I made a game for the launch of the Ouya, and that actually also started as for a sponsored game jam. Ouya did a 10-day game jam. I made a game for that, and then I produced it further up to release. And then apparently my pattern is making games for the launch of Kickstarted hardware, because the next thing that I did was I got my Oculus Rift and I heard about this game jam and decided I would do that.
Nice.
And winning the game jam just sort of was like my signal that, yeah, this is the one.
Yeah. And so 9 years as a game developer working in the industry, I would imagine. I mean, what was that like? No? Okay.
So I say 9 years, but that's like 9 years from the very first time that I started, hacking together terrible Java code as a student into something that could be called a game.
Oh.
Which I think is, I think that's the right place to sort of start, mark the beginning of your journey as a game developer. In terms of professional game development, though, it's been much shorter. I did a little bit of work interning during college for some AAA game studios. I worked with Bethesda Softworks on the Fallout series, and I did a little bit of tech design work with Sony Santa Monica on the God of War Ascension game.
Whoa.
And then I spent a year as the lead game designer of a company that did not make any games, which is a little complicated.
That sounds complicated.
Yes. They were a government contractor, and I was mostly working as like a UI designer for them. And then but I had the title of lead game designer because that's where my real interest was. And so I saved up some money during that time, and that gave me the ability to go indie for real about a year and a half ago.
What's it been like so far going indie?
A little scary in some ways, but really, really nice. I mean, working for yourself is great in many ways because you can, flexible schedule. I don't need to ask my boss if I can take the day off or anything like that. I work from the comfort of home, etc. At the same time, you have to sort of arrange your own income. So there's a lot of risk involved. I think I'm luckier than most because I had a game come out a while back that was successful enough that I don't really have to worry about getting money to eat, at least for a while. But I'm always thinking none of my income is guaranteed. It all depends on people buying my games, and that could dry up tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's looking. If the last couple of weeks, and again, I don't want to beat over that dead horse too much, but if the last couple of weeks have been in any indication, I think you are headed in the right direction. I would say.
I hope so.
Yeah.
It's weird, the different perspectives you can get on things, because I've had some people tell me that I'm, Darknet's really well known, and I'm, ahead of the curve or some sort of variation on that. But at the same time, it's really not that prevalent right now. Maybe within a very insular community, people have heard of Darknet, but beyond that, there's most people have no clue what my game is. They're not really paying attention to the Oculus scene yet. My traffic numbers on my website are not very high.
Mm-hmm.
So it could definitely, it could still crash and burn at this point.
Yeah. I'm glad you keep a measure of, I don't know, not reality. Not let yourself get taken away by the hype wave or the hype train. So.
Right.
Yeah, good. Do you view this project as something that you want to turn into a career, or is virtual reality something that you want to stay a part of, or what is your thought process in that?
I think virtual reality is a really, really cool medium, and a very inviting medium for games. I would say that game design is my career more than virtual reality.
Mm-hmm.
If virtual reality doesn't happen, if it goes the way of 3D TVs or something, I'm going to go right back into designing games. And if I end up working further in virtual reality, it's going to be, making the kind of games that I enjoy making.
Mm. Cool. And so do you, from a designer's perspective, is there really a big difference between designing a game for VR versus, your top-of-the-mill legacy interface?
Yeah, there definitely is. But I think it's it's in perhaps more subtle ways than people normally expect. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of games that you can port to virtual reality that are, just like any first-person shooter game, or games in which you're in a cockpit, and everyone thinks of those as the first, most obvious applications for virtual reality. And I guess they're not wrong. But I think you have to think hard about what the advantages of virtual reality are, and what you can do in virtual reality that you can't do otherwise. And so some of those are really are not that obvious. The feeling of being surrounded is something that you couldn't do before. Or playing with 3D depth is something that you couldn't do before. I think that's one of the reasons that horror games have gotten a really fantastic reception, because those rely on what you can't see, or feelings of claustrophobia or something sneaking up behind you, things that sort of naturally lend themselves or are easy to discover in VR. for my own game, I'm sort of constantly on the lookout for ways to take advantage of VR that aren't necessarily obvious. And so I've got like levels that wrap around the player and surround you. Feelings of like acceleration and zooming into and out of the nodes of the game. Mm-hmm. And trying to sort of get the right amount of like playful feeling of motion without making somebody sick. I'm trying to, have a variety of depth of objects so that some things seem really close to you because that can feel really cool. Mm-hmm. But if you do it too much, then everyone's constantly getting double vision. So, I don't know. That's kind of a rambling answer, but I guess what I'm saying is there are a lot of subtle differences that can add up, and the difficulty is sort of paying attention to all of them, figuring out how to integrate it.
How long did it take you to learn, those subtleties? Is it still a learning process as we speak, or is it more like, it'll take you 2 months to pretty much get down the kinks? What do you think?
I think I'm definitely still figuring it out, and so is everyone else. My expectation is that, there's a lot of things that nobody knows, and nobody, questions that no one has even thought to ask yet. Mm-hmm. Darknet has kind of a weird way of presenting itself. Like, it's a first-person game, but it's a strategy game, and it's sort of like first-person moving from interface to interface in a particular way. And that seems different to me than like first-person games where you're playing a human being who's sitting in the driver's seat or who's walking around an environment. Mm-hmm. And there are other things too, like there's a demo called Iceland where you're just sort of floating above an Arctic landscape, and it's just purely you're a camera that's going on this scenic journey. And I'm sure I could name other examples. But my point is, like, there are lots of different ways of even like basic ways of putting the player in the world, ways of casting the player. It could be that we haven't even tried out the good ways yet, that people are going to keep on figuring out different ways to make it a comfortable bridge to VR. And maybe like 10 years from now, it could be that all the good VR games are doing something that we haven't even invented yet from a design perspective. So I guess I'm trying to keep I'd like to be one of the games that sort of is figuring that out mm-hmm. and is on the frontier of it. But who knows? I don't know. I feel like we might be much more primitive than we think we are.
It certainly I'm not to knock on VR developers, but it certainly feels like it is a budding way of thinking. Trying to readjust your brain to think, from the user's perspective. What is that user going to feel? What is that user going to see? So I definitely think there will be plenty of room to grow. And do you think, is that the reason why the big publishers and the big game studios are not touching or not outreaching to VR developers because they themselves don't know what it is that that makes a game successful? Is that one of the reasons, you think?
Yeah, I think that they are evaluating risk in a different way. Like their costs would presumably be much higher, and so if it's not even clear whether VR will succeed as a platform, and B, whether they know how to actually take advantage of VR, then the risk is just too high for most of them. I think that's why it's so nice that we have an active developer community that's sort of doing a lot of experiments. A lot of people, myself included, have sort of committed to making a game so that we can finish something good in time for the launch of the Oculus Rift. But that also means that other people need to continue the role of experimenting and, figuring out different ways of doing things.
Because otherwise, we're gonna, the industry and the technology goes in stagnant already into the market. Is that why?
Well, because I think that experimentation is a good thing, and like someone like me, I developed CS. It worked well. I've tried to improve it for Darknet, and now I feel like I've sort of I'm playing my hand. It's already been dealt to me, And so, I'm making Darknet. That's going to be my best shot at producing a really excellent virtual reality game.
Yeah.
But there are tons of other different ways of doing it, and I'm no longer one of the people who's like experimenting with a bunch of different things. I've designed, and at this point I need to execute. And so from now until the launch of the Oculus Rift, I am in production mode, not experimentation mode.
Oh, thank you for clarifying that. I know that's definitely. And how does the not knowing when the Oculus Rift will get launched affect your, your line of production?
It's difficult, of course. What I've done is I've essentially written up a schedule for myself that's kind of a worst case scenario schedule. Like I set a date that I think of as the earliest that I could possibly need the game to be done. And, the hope is then that I'm sort of underestimating and that I'll have a couple extra weeks or months or whatever for polish. But if that doesn't happen, I still plan to have the game done and ready for launch.
So
it's just going to be a lot of work.
I could imagine. So we've seen, you kind of talked about how the mobile gaming, sector of the industry is quite crowded. And how do you see the current VR developer, race? So, is it getting crowded or is it barely getting started? What do you feel like?
I think it's not crowded right now. It could be that I start to feel differently, but it's hard to judge. From my perspective, the VR exclusive games, or the games that are like really, really being built around virtual reality, are still pretty few and far between. A lot more are going to start popping up, but those ones are going to have trouble, finishing a new game in time for the launch of the Rift. Yeah. Beyond that, I think there's going to be a lot of games that are ported to virtual reality, but as Palmer Luckey said at the beginning of this year, ports don't work that well for virtual reality, with exceptions. So it's not clear to me whether, if there's a ton of ported games, they're going to crowd the space and muscle out some of the made-for-VR games, or whether they're going to sort of naturally drift towards the bottom.
How many years do you think it'll take before virtual reality starts having a software production cycle? I mean, right now it's just everyone's everywhere trying to figure out when to launch. But you know how the gaming industry gets into these cycles of November, December, and this spring is dry months. I mean, how long before it gets to that point? I take it requires some more maturing. But do you have any?
Well, I think that sort of pattern is just something that emerges naturally if you have a powerful enough, economic engine behind everything, and you get enough developers who want to make for that environment. So, I think it just depends on the launch of the Rift. I think it depends on whether VR sort of makes a big splash. If VR ends up huge, if it's bigger than most people expect, then I think you're almost immediately going to see, a surge of developer interest, and that's a great thing. If it doesn't do that well, if it sort of just becomes like a curiosity or, a peripheral for really hardcore players, then I think it's hard for me to judge because I don't really know much about software dev cycles or the wider industry. But I think it would be a lot quieter.
What is successful to you in your mind? In terms of the Oculus Rift consumer version 1, will success be defined by numbers, by publicity? Is it 1 million units sold? What do you think is successful? And if you don't mind me asking, do you have an expected return on investment for Darknet? And don't feel like sharing it, by the way. You don't have to.
Right. Yeah. Well, for the Rift, for what success means, obviously you can you can judge it along different axes. So I think one of their big successes would be just sort of becoming something that's socially acceptable. That's not just like a really nerdy thing for people who are, isolating themselves. Techno fetishism is a term that I've heard.
My favorite kind of fetish. Sorry.
So in terms of like market success, I do think it's going to come down to numbers probably. And like I'm like no expert, but my impression, my imagination of this is that it's successful if it feels more like a console launch than a peripheral launch. So, the Xbox and the PlayStation 4, they were selling a few million in the months after release in that sort of holiday season. And I think if Oculus does that well, then it's going to be considered a big success. If it does better than that, if it sells, several million in the first few months, then I think it's a big success. If it sells under $1 million, I really don't know what their financials are like, what numbers they need. But I think that would be maybe not underwhelming, but not sort of the world transforming impact that a lot of VR enthusiasts have been hoping for.
Yeah, it would still be hugely successful by Kickstarter standards. I mean,
of course, but I mean, it already is.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, go ahead.
As for Darknet itself, I've sort of like drawn up some numbers for like what I need to break even and things like that. But there's a lot in the air, and the range is just so wide. Like, it is so easy for an indie game to release and just disappear into the ether and like sell very few copies and be forgotten forever. Which is kind of what my Ouya game did to some extent. And so I'm sort of keeping that in mind. And then on the other side of things, if you're one of the top, 0.01% or whatever, then games can do extremely well. So it's just such a crazy widespread. It's too hard for me to sort of make a guess there.
Yeah. I completely understand. It's anybody's guess at this point. It's so early. In terms of your working ethic, your work ethic, and how you go about designing and creating games, can you give me a glimpse into what that looks like? How do you, for example, go off and make a game? What is your do you have like a notepad with a to-do list? What does it look like?
It takes various forms early on because I can get an idea from anywhere. I have like a Google Doc, buried away that's called Game Ideas, and it's just this constantly growing series of games that I think would be interesting to make or at least prototype. So usually there are a lot of those that are sort of bouncing around in my head at any given time. So at some point, if I'm going to start working on them, I start out with a prototype, and I tend to be bad about actually carving out time to make them, which is why game jams have worked so well for me, because that's like, somebody else is giving you a deadline, and you have to finish this sort of at least prototype level game within that time. And so that's what inspired my Ouya game. That's what created CS. It's kind of what helps get me going. After that, more recently I've been spending a lot of time with like notebook and pencil, and I'll actually go places where I don't have any internet access because it's less distracting that way. And a lot of times I'll just sort of sit and think about, brainstorm, design, kind of plot out what I need to do. And that's more the fun part. And now I'm sort of into the production part, which I don't enjoy quite as much, which is sitting in front of the computer and coding and working in Unity and actually building everything.
And then
after a long time of that, the game is done.
Wow. And have you, by the way, have you considered Unreal Engine 4, or I mean, how happy are you with Unity at this point?
I'm really happy with Unity. Cool. I had already bought a Unity Pro license for the Ouya game, and so that wasn't kind of a part of the question for me. I know that's a big deal for people who are considering which engine to use for the first time. But yeah, Unity has been amazing. I found it really easy to work with from, I felt really comfortable with it from the first 2 weeks that I started using it. Nice. And the Unity Asset Store is a miracle. There's a lot of help online, really active community. And so I haven't even really considered moving to any other engine. Unity is just too widely supported. It has, so many people behind it.
Yeah.
Just doesn't make sense to go to anything else for me.
Cool. Have you, going back to what you said earlier, as an indie developer who had a game, who was able to put out a game and then it sort of disappeared into the ether, how do you anticipate doing differently this time around with Darknet? I mean, how just fundamentally, how do indie developers, keep their games, in the public sphere?
Yeah. I mean, it's always going to be difficult. There's lots of answers to that. Common parts of those answers are going to be things like showing the game off at shows. So I'm going to PAX East, I mentioned. Talking about the game as much as possible, I guess like I am right now. I've got a website with a blog I'm running and trying to do sort of an open development thing where I'm talking about the game at least every week. And I've got a perpetual Ask Me Anything going on Reddit. Plus Twitter account, Facebook account for people who want to follow everything there, etc. So I'm putting a lot more effort, first of all, into just telling people about the game. Mm-hmm. But the other side of things is, the platform itself. So Ouya, Ouya did really well as a Kickstarter. Ouya did better than Oculus did. And I don't think, the hardware was shaping up to deliver in quite the same way. It could just be a difference in, what people expected out of the Ouya or what they dreamt of and what it really delivered, because it did what it said it needed to do. Just by the time the Ouya came out, there wasn't that much demand for it seemed. So my game was one of the featured games at launch, but that didn't end up counting for much. And my hope is that with Oculus, I can again be one of the more visible games at launch, and that this time it'll mean more. Because with the Ouya game, it had to be free to try, which I was okay with, but that meant a lot of people who were trying it out for the first time just downloaded the free trials of everything and then never bought anything, or at least didn't buy my game. Maybe with Oculus, people are going to be more interested in getting deeper experiences right off the bat.
Yeah, that was the thing that I was gonna go in the direction of, because now that Oculus, has this infusion of money and resources, I think, it's looking a lot better for you. I mean, in terms of just on the business aspect of this, have you considered partnering with a bigger company, publisher, whoever, and how do you work out those deals between you, a small indie developer, and someone big who wants to throw money at you to say, hey, make this thing amazing for virtual reality? Have you thought about that?
A little bit. So I don't think it makes that much sense for me to partner with a bigger company in a big way. Mm-hmm. Essentially what I've been doing so far, I designed the game to be something that I could build on my own. From the ground up, it's made to be a one-man project. That said, I've been trying to get help on sort of select parts of the game, so music, art, maybe certain aspects of programming. And that's going to sort of bring the budget up. And that's coming straight out of my savings, which is a little scary. So it could be at some point that I try to get some sort of financial help to allay the risk of the game, to allow me to sort of get a little bit more help and go further and be more willing to part with money than I otherwise would be. Mm-hmm. And that would produce a better game. But that would be pretty small scale, I don't think the game would support a huge infusion of, $1 million or something. It just, at this point, it would be tough to grow it in an elegant way.
Yeah, it certainly seems like there is a lot of design that I can see is much of a labor of love to you. I figured it'd be difficult to, all of a sudden have all this money and then you have to delegate and trust other people with your work, with your baby. I don't know.
But it's also just I have sort of embraced the constraints of the project early on. I wrote a blog post about this actually, and I started with a quote that I really liked, where somebody was saying, like, if I'm asked what would you do with $1 million, my answer is probably something terrible. Like, sometimes what makes a game or any creative project great is the limitations that you place on it at the beginning. And so for me, it's like, well, I can't do fancy art myself, and so I ended up with this game with this sort of interesting abstract art, and that is part of the appeal of it. Or, I can't afford to make a ton of content, and so I make a game that procedurally generates its challenges. And that also has sort of become one of the advantages, one of like the selling points of the game. If I had a lot more resources, I'm not even sure I would make something as good.
By the time the Oculus Rift gets launched, when everything is all said and done in terms of developing Darknet, can you give us a glimpse into what we could expect? Will there be multiplayer? Is that even a thing? Will there be leaderboards? What sorts of things will we be able to be wowed by?
Leaderboards is multiplayer, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, like a side by side. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I haven't started talking about that. I do have some ideas along those lines, but I'm not quite ready to sort of reveal that yet, just because it's still in the works, and I don't want to promise anything I can't deliver on. But I am planning to have sort of a metagame layer on top of sort of the standard gameplay, sort of a reason why you are hacking into all of these networks, a reason why you're taking on more difficult challenges, something to sort of motivate the player to continue playing. I'm pretty interested about where that could go.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds really good. In terms of story, I was gonna go in that in that direction and ask you about the story of the game. Is there gonna be like a backdrop to what you are actually doing here?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have sort of some light story that's partially sort of introduce the player to the world. To there's going to need to be sort of a period where the game is teaching itself to you. And I think stories really can be helpful for that. For the later parts of the game, I'm sort of going to abdicate from the story a little bit. And that's going to tie in a little more with sort of the metagame stuff I was talking about earlier.
Right. What is your biggest challenge right now? What are your biggest obstacles that you face?
Time.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I've sort of been scheduling and rescheduling, trying to make sure that I'm fitting everything in. And right now, the numbers work out. Like, I think I can do it all if I can keep to my schedule. But that's going to be really difficult. I'm being pretty ambitious, and there are not many features that I would be happy leaving out at this point. Like, there's so much that I've really fallen in love with that I feel like I can't cut. So that leaves it up to me to sort of deliver on time. Mm-hmm. And of course, because we don't know what on time is, I'm being really aggressive about it. So
because on time could mean winter 2014, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, what an interesting race that you are in. We'll
see. I feel like there's other developers as well who might sort of, I've seen some people who are saying, like, our game's going to be finished by December. And I'm sort of thinking, well, the Oculus Rift could come out before then. Mm-hmm. And, it's not like every developer has to be a launch title. People are still going to be interested in getting software, a month or 2 or 3 after release. I mean, presumably forever after release. But I do think that it's kind of cool to be right at the front line.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I find it, not just cool, but more or less historic. When I think about when the Oculus Rift gets released, I think about, what are some of the obstacles it will face, and I think that being a whole new hardware platform that it is, I don't know if consumers are going to be quite ready to to know or curate what good content is or isn't, and I fear that they might not. People might be turned off by that fact. So I bring up the Nintendo Wii. That what they did was they bundled up the hardware with the Wii Sports, and you had a demonstrations of what the hardware could do. I wonder if Oculus is thinking in those same lines, and is in this crazy world that we live in where everything is possible. Facebook buys Oculus. Are you have you ever considered the idea of porting your game, or not porting, but bundling your game with the Oculus Rift when it gets released? It's one of those games, you have one of those games that it's just, there's nowhere else where you can experience Darknet, except the Oculus Rift.
Well, it's not the first time I've been asked about bundling, but I first of all, I don't know if Oculus is interested in that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I don't know if Darknet is quite the right fit for that, because I am trying to make ultimately a pretty hardcore experience. It's a deep strategy game that you're meant to play for a fairly long time, and takes some time to get into, to learn it. Hopefully not very long. I hope to make it accessible, but depth is a higher priority for me. And so, the wonderful thing about Wii Sports is anybody can just figure out how that works, can pick it up and play and have fun with it and really get the purpose of the hardware. Mm. So, I think there's probably going to be other content that's made to be sort of introductory to the Rift. And that's kind of the better fit for bundling.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, in terms of input, and this is where I'd like to get your opinion on, what do you think is the perfect input for virtual reality, from a developer's point of view and designer and all that good stuff?
Well, we could just say perfect input is, a replication of reality, something where I could, reach out and touch something, a virtual object, and have it react against my touch. Because then, if we wanted to do that, heck, you could just code in your own mouse and keyboard in the virtual world if you felt like it. Obviously, that's not something that's going to be happening anytime soon. It's nowhere near feasible. Tons of unsolved problems. That's far future stuff. In the near future, I think I am a lot more pessimistic about motion control solutions than most other VR enthusiasts. And that's because I think it's a lot like virtual reality vision. If you don't get it perfect, people notice it's just really wrong. It doesn't feel good. You might think it's really cool and you might suffer through it, but that doesn't make it a good experience. So I have a Razer Hydra, and so far I really haven't had great experiences with it. It's really neato. It's a cool gizmo, but I've had so many frustrating experiences trying to actually use it in a game, and I've gotten to try out a couple other motion control solutions. None of them seem like something that I really want to get behind or plan to use a lot. So for me, early on, this is not answering what's the perfect VR input. But for Darknet, I'm focusing on what Oculus has said. They said seated experiences and controller input for early on, for first generation. So I'm making a game where you can experience it in full without motion controls, with just button presses, which is fine with me. I feel like Palmer has also made the comment that a mouse and keyboard is a superhuman input. The idea being that using a mouse to point and click at things is actually way more efficient than a lot of like Hollywood's vision of how future UIs might work.
Mm-hmm.
Waving your arms around gets tiring after a while, and so buttons have a place even in the future.
That is eye-opening that you said that, actually, because we all dream of that Minority Report moment. And yeah, I could see myself after 10 minutes of flailing my arms around, feeling, damn, this is really tired. Where is my mouse and keyboard? That's I never.
I don't want to be too down on it because there's so many cool things you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people who are excited about just the stuff that mimics reality in some way. You're using the STEM controller or something to represent a gun or to reach out and pick things up in the world. And that could be really cool for select games. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Wii Sports we were just talking about, Wii Sports controllers were a good fit.
Yeah.
I just don't think that they're the end-all be-all. I think even though we have the Wii, nobody wants to do their web browsing or whatever without a mouse or a touch screen.
Yeah. I tried using my Wii to browse the web, and it was a pain in the ass.
The Leap Motion actually offers some ways to do that, where you can click on things and you can scroll using your hand movements.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that sort of demonstrates some of the challenges or the problems that are going to come up with motion controls. Where like if it's not perfect, if it's occasionally losing track of where your fingers are, it becomes really frustrating.
I agree.
And you're holding your hands out in front of floating above the screen does get tiring after a while. And after, it's sort of like why bother? We've gotten really good about dealing with windows and tabs and buttons on a screen.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take a long time, I think, before virtual reality brings us to that software matures to the point that it's better than what we have right now.
What do you think it'll take for virtual reality to make that leap? I mean, what is it that it's missing right now?
I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I'm sure I'd be pursuing it.
Yeah.
That's one of those things that probably is going to need all that experimentation that we talked about early on.
Yeah.
And I think if virtual reality succeeds as sorry,
mm-hmm.
if it succeeds as an entertainment medium, then you're going to get enough interest from developers and the wider public that people are going to start experimenting with things.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they're going to start figuring out what patterns work best and what applications are the best fit for the technology, and maybe start playing around with motion controls and things like that. I think you saw like a similar process take place with touch screens on mobile phones, where once app development was opened up, there were a lot of games with terrible controls in them. And only recently have we started to get, generally pretty good about that, like understanding what feels good on a screen, a touch screen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's surprising how much amazing technology surrounds us, and how just how you're saying, like, you think that we are witnessing the birth of virtual reality, and to the layman, this, speaking to you would feel like, man, this guy is straight up knows everything about virtual reality. But even you will admit that there is so much yet to learn. And it's I feel like it's the same way with almost everything: controllers, touch screens.
Yeah, there's unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
Things that we don't even know, we don't know.
It's humbling. It's definitely a humbling thing to think about, because at the same time it's extremely exciting, because I have no idea where this is all going to end up. I mean, what is a dream for you? Where do you dream for this all to end up? Virtual reality, darknet, your careers and your goals, all that good stuff.
I don't know. Truth is, I came to virtual reality through games, whereas I think other virtual reality enthusiasts came to it with a dream intact from the beginning, a vision of the metaverse or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really how I came to it. Like I could imagine that being very cool. I could imagine like living a world that's mediated through this technology. But the reason I can imagine that is because I'm already doing that. Like I already spend almost my entire day on a computer, and I'm very comfortable with that. So I could imagine like that changing shape in different ways. Maybe it's a different interface. Maybe I can be in some virtual paradise or something as I'm living out my life through technology. But I don't necessarily have like an endpoint in mind that I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, that makes the journey, I feel like, that much more exciting.
Yeah, and part of it is I feel like I don't have a ton of control over it.
I agree.
Like, I think other people... I don't mean like we're inevitably headed towards some, dystopian future or something like that. I just mean the answer is out there. Like, if there's a really good way of using virtual reality, eventually we're going to land on it. Because I know other people are excited about this and are pursuing that angle. And so I'm happy to be followed by them. Like, I'm trying to make a really good game for early virtual reality.
Mm-hmm.
If other people are working on making, much more expansive software for more mature virtual reality, I'm happy to follow them.
One of the paths that leads me to think in is, the thing that I honestly think virtual reality, the ultimate input device is figuring out how to, pick up brain signals and having you interpret those brain signals as, because your game CS is amazingly simple and yet complex and full of the nuances that once you start picking them up, like, oh, this feels right. And I would, just a simple emotive epoch, for example, hooked to my laptop, picking up signals. I had a demo. I tried this demo at this conference, App Nation, a few months ago, where this developer was showing you a car, and he had this little machine that could pick up your brain signals when you were focused on the car, and so the car would flip the moment your brain signal picked up in that direction. I figured it wouldn't be that hard, but then again, I'm talking out of my butt. It wouldn't be that hard to integrate something like that where I'm playing CS and I look at the node that I want to attack and I just go in that direction. But again, I'm talking out of my butt.
Well, yeah. I haven't gotten a chance to try the emotive epoch myself. I've gotten to try other similar sort of EEG style brain input devices. Sorry. And my experience and my understanding of them is like they can only detect really general things reliably. Mm. Like it's pretty tough for it to be able to like teach your brain to fire off certain inputs reliably, like, left or right or something.
Mm.
Instead, it's better at just sort of detecting, like, how focused you are or something like that. So the demos that work really well for those things tend to be a demo where you can only do one thing. It's like, focus on the car and try to make it flip, and eventually the car will flip. When it's other things, when it's like you're trying to control a choice or like movements, it tends to be a lot harder to use. Like it'll accidentally read the wrong inputs, or it's just too hard to. It's only using a couple of different sensors, and so it's hard for it to get a high enough resolution image of your brain, essentially, to know what's going on. So again, I'm sort of like the downer, ruining everybody's fun. But like those things, they would need a lot more work.
Yeah.
And I don't think they sort of have like the resolution, the sensing ability right now to become like a viable means of control.
Mm. Is it a matter of funding? Is it a matter of finding that rich person that doesn't have any, that doesn't have any anything to do with their money, and then just telling them, hey, I can find you the best people on earth that can work on this and put out a product that will have no rival. I mean, is that the matter, that there isn't enough people with with the money, with the resources to put the brain power into this because it's so fringe, or am I completely wrong? I mean, what do you think in terms of what is stopping this?
I think probably the technology is just not quite there yet, and it also could be like we still have such a vague understanding of how our brains work that it's probably really just a difficult problem to begin with. So like I think probably the path to success is something akin to the Rift, where Palmer didn't show up and say, like, I think I can solve this problem, give me money. He started out with a prototype. Like, he discovered that he was able, thankfully, to hack it together, with affordable parts. And he could show that to John Carmack and then, sort of get some momentum building, get a bunch of really respected people to, speak for him, and then launch a Kickstarter, that kind of got it all going. But the proof of concept came first. So I think somewhere, in this case, for something like brain input, you might need someone in a lab somewhere to finally make it work. Because I actually think that's probably a much more difficult problem than VR. And goodness knows VR is difficult enough.
Yeah. But it's in my mind, my crazy mind, I think it's in the future it will be it'll be the
it would
standard.
Be bigger than the Oculus Rift, I bet.
Yeah, it'll be it'll be the standard input, to control
Facebook
the computer.
will buy
world.
you for $3 billion.
Oh my God, yeah, immediately. So you come from the game world into the virtual reality sphere. Are you a gamer? I mean, what?
Oh yeah.
What are you most interested in? What kind of games do you like to play?
I tend to play a fair number of strategy. I tend to like turn-based strategy, and I grew up on RTSs. And a lot of just like the big games out there. I've definitely played a lot of first-person shooters, and big fan of a lot of role-playing games. I tend to not do so much like simulation or racing or sports games. I own consoles, but I didn't grow up playing them, and I don't play much of them now. It's usually only like certain games that are only available on consoles. Yeah. So, but I mean, most recently I've been playing mostly indie games, and so those are often really hard to put into a genre box. With exceptions. But I'm trying to think of like the last games that I actually played through all the way. Probably the Banner Saga and Broken Age, the Double Fine Adventure.
Wow.
Both of which were Kickstarters. So apparently my life revolves around Kickstarter products.
What are your top 5 favorite games of all time? If you had to name 5.
Well, that's tough. Probably top one is Morrowind. The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. Oh. I was a stupidly hardcore fan about that game, which I could talk about for a long time. Mass Effect series, my favorite among those probably Mass Effect 2.
Same here.
Maybe Mass Effect 3, I really liked those. Possibly, I'm trying to think of games that I just got obsessed about for some time. Battlefield 1942 might have been my favorite first-person shooter of all time. Not, nowadays it's obviously outclassed by other things, but in its time, I think it was a huge step forward.
Yeah.
Possibly something like Braid, the indie puzzle game.
Yeah.
And I still have one spot left. Gosh.
Yeah, if I were to drop you in the middle of an island with just 5 games for the rest of your life.
See, whenever somebody gives me one of those hypotheticals, I'm the asshole who starts treating it picking it apart like a lawyer, figuring out. Well, then I don't want my favorite games. I want the games that'll last the longest. And okay, well, we need to negotiate. Do I have an internet source and power supplies? And blah blah blah.
Well, we
But
can
I
go
understand
that
your
route
intent.
if you want. I mean, we can tango, two can tango on this one. But yeah, you have no internet. You have only one solar panel as your sustainable power source, and yes, you will be stuck there. Let's make it 30 years.
Yeah. I mean, probably I pick something that lets me call for help. I don't know.
But that's,
I mean, I've been playing games my whole life.
yeah.
Right? And I sometimes have sort of dry spells where I don't play anything for a good while, which I'd say is probably me right now because, I worked hard to make time for the Banner Saga and Broken Age before GDC.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's like I'm looking in my schedule in the future, and it's like I'm not going to have any time for games for like months.
Well, speaking of your list, I am a total fan of Mass Effect. Mass Effect 2. My main goal in it was to find a way to have sex with Miranda. Great game. Then 1942, I played on PSN. I played 1941, and I think it's maybe a port over. I'm not sure, but beautiful looking game. And I remember feeling, you start getting into that game, and it's just getting adjusted to the World War II weapons. I mean, it's a whole new different universe to think that people used to shoot guns like that, that responded that way and had that.
Well, once upon a time, like every game was a World War II shooter. Yeah. The market was flooded for a while.
I remember that.
And then it was like a breath of fresh air when finally modern military shooters started coming out.
And then
now it's the opposite.
And now it's a modern military shooter fatigue.
So we're moving on to futuristic.
Yep.
Obviously, those are the only three categories in which you can make games. So I don't know what they're going to do after that.
I hope
Maybe just start over.
I hope they bring back time travel games. The time travel. I don't know if there's Time Splitters was a pretty interesting first-person shooter where we were traveling through time.
I think I rented that once.
Yeah, it wasn't very good, but I mean, if they need ideas, they could always go into time travel.
Braid's the better time travel game. I insist.
Tell me about Braid because I never, blasphemously speaking, I've never been able to touch it.
Yeah, it's a puzzle game, a puzzle platformer made in I think 2006, 7, 8. But it was one of the first really big indie game hits on Xbox Live Arcade, and it's just really, really well designed. It's a very dense game. It presents itself really well, and it's just excellent mind-bending puzzles where you need to think about time in different ways in every world stage. So, the rules of time are constantly, are changing on you, and you need to sort of creatively adjust your thinking to conquer them. And there's a lot more to be said about that in terms of story and all that, but I think that's sort of where the genius of that game lies.
Speaking of indie game development and Braid, I remember watching this movie on Netflix where they were documenting the Braid creator, the guys from Super Meat Boy, and it was just it was a really well done story. And I think
Indie Game the movie.
Yeah, very well done. And I feel like when I interact with developers such as yourselves, I wish I understood what is motivating you personally, because I feel like I see the documentaries like that, and I think they give me the impression that a lot of indie game developers are thinking about doing this so that they can make that one game that'll give them that notch status where they'll never have to work a day in their lives. I mean, for you, what is personally motivating you to keep making games? And are you also planning on getting notched, or want that status of celebrity?
I wouldn't say no to it, but for me, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be making games regardless of how Darknet goes or anything else, or even if I was working on a different game. Darknet is not sort of the end all be all of it for me. It's one of my many dream games that I could be working on. So my motivation is the love of game design itself. It's not a particular game that I needed to make. It's not that I have a message coded deep inside me that I'm just trying to get out or something like that. And it's not a certain level of market success, because I think indie games are a terrible field to go into if you're looking to get rich reliably. For me, it's just, I really love thinking about gameplay. I find it incredibly fascinating. And, if I wasn't working in games, I'd still be collecting game ideas constantly, because that part is just what happens naturally to me. I can't turn it off. I'll look at weird patterns in the floor or something and accidentally start designing game rules for it as if it was a board. That's just how my mind is wired. And, I've enjoyed games so much, I've had so many powerful experiences with them, that it's never been a question for me. I feel very lucky that early on I knew what I wanted to do, and now I have the ability to pursue it, so that's what I'm doing.
Mr. E Mcneill, it's been truly an honor and a pleasure to get to share, have you share your passion with me and the rest of my listeners. I got to thank you one more time for being such a wonderful, true scholar and gentleman of virtual reality. How can people...
Likewise, thank you for having me on.
Thank you. How can people stay up to date? How can people follow up with what you're up to? All that good stuff, so that, they can keep supporting what you're doing.
Well, as I mentioned, Darknet has its own website at darknetgame.com, and there are links on there for Twitter, Facebook, mailing list, however you prefer to keep up to date. Probably the best is the game's dedicated subreddit, which is rdarkcom. There's a link on the website for that as well, and I'm running a perpetual Ask Me Anything thread there, so feel free to stop by and ask any questions you might have.
Awesome. All the links will be posted in the show notes. Again, thank you, Mr. E Mcneill.
Thank you.